Rajesh Malhotra, a wealthy 55-year-old Indian businessman, Meera, his elegant wife hiding a dangerous secret, and Daniel Hayes, a young Australian worker who stepped into their lives with charm but ended it with blood. What began as a forbidden romance turned into a chilling conspiracy, and one night in Melbourne, it exploded into murder. This is not just a love affair gone wrong, it's a deadly betrayal that shocked an entire community. Rajesh Malhotra had always been seen as a man who built his life with discipline and ambition. After moving to Melbourne years ago, he opened a small Indian restaurant that slowly grew into a successful chain spread across the city. At 55, he was respected in the community, admired for his work ethic, and envied for his wealth. His home in an upscale neighborhood reflected his years of struggle and triumph. Beside him through all of this was his wife, Meera, who at 48 carried herself with grace and poise. Their marriage, at least in public, was considered strong. They hosted family gatherings, supported charities, and projected the image of stability. Yet beneath the polished exterior, Meera lived in silence, feeling the absence of warmth and attention that she once longed for. Rajesh was devoted to his business, spending most of his days managing restaurants, signing contracts, and traveling for work. Meera, meanwhile, felt invisible in her own home, her days filled with emptiness. The turning point came when Rajesh hired a new worker for one of his restaurants. Daniel Hayes, a 27-year-old Australian, joined the staff to help with operations. Young, ambitious, and full of energy, Daniel stood out immediately. He had a casual confidence, a charm that drew people toward him, and a hunger for opportunities that Rajesh admired. While Rajesh appreciated Daniel's work ethic, it was Meera who noticed something more. She would often visit the restaurants casually, but after Daniel's arrival, her visits became frequent. What started as polite exchanges quickly stretched into longer moments. Meera felt alive again in his presence, as if someone finally saw her. Daniel, with his easy smile and youthful energy, made her feel wanted. Their conversations began with harmless topics, food, travel, and life in Australia, but soon carried a personal tone. He asked about her interests, complimented her appearance, and showed curiosity about her lonely routines. For Meera, these were things Rajesh no longer cared to ask. She found herself looking forward to these encounters, dressing more carefully, and making excuses to be near Daniel. In a matter of weeks, their connection grew deeper. Secretly exchanging numbers, they began texting late into the night. Each message pulled Meera further into a world she had long craved but never dared to imagine. Soon, they arranged meetings outside the restaurant. A coffee shop visit turned into dinners, and dinners turned into stolen weekends in places far away from familiar eyes. Meera was overwhelmed with guilt but also addicted to the rush of secrecy. She felt years younger, consumed by the excitement of being desired again. To Daniel, the relationship carried a different weight. While he enjoyed the attention, he also saw in Meera a doorway to comfort, money, and opportunities he could never access alone. She began showering him with small gifts, transferring money quietly from joint accounts, and ensuring he had whatever he needed. At home, Rajesh remained unaware of the depth of her betrayal, though he noticed subtle changes. Meera was distracted, sometimes absent, and unusually protective of her phone. To her, the risks seemed worth the pleasure, but as the affair deepened, it stopped being a harmless escape. What began as an intoxicating secret slowly transformed into a dangerous bond, one that would push both Meera and Daniel into a place from which there would be no return. Daniel Hayes lived two very different lives. On the surface, he was the hard-working young man who quickly became indispensable at Rajesh Malhotra's restaurant chain. He learned fast, worked long hours, and made himself seem trustworthy to his employer. But beyond the workplace, Daniel's reality was far from stable. He carried the weight of mounting debts, careless spending, and a history of broken relationships. He had grown up restless, always chasing quick rewards instead of steady discipline. When he crossed paths with Meera Malhotra, he saw more than just a woman drawn to him. He saw a lifeline, a way to escape his financial mess and secure the comfort he had always dreamed of. At first, his attention to Meera was playful and flattering. She seemed flattered by the charm he poured on her, and Daniel quickly noticed how deeply she responded. The small gifts she gave him turned into larger ones, expensive watches, clothes, and even cash to cover his overdue bills. Daniel realized that the more affection he showed, the more she gave. What began as a convenient affair became a calculated move in his mind. He understood her vulnerability, her loneliness, and her desperate need to feel alive again, and he used it to his advantage. Meanwhile, Rajesh had begun noticing subtle cracks in his marriage. Meera was more distracted, often leaving the house with vague explanations, returning late, and avoiding his questions. She no longer seemed invested in their social gatherings, often excusing herself with fabricated excuses. Rajesh's instincts told him something was wrong. He had lived too long with discipline and calculation not to notice deception. He started keeping mental notes of her behavior, checking her expenses, and quietly observing her. Though he refrained from confronting her directly, he felt a storm building beneath the calm exterior of their household. For Rajesh, reputation meant everything. He was terrified not of heartbreak, but of humiliation, of whispers among friends and family that could tarnish the image he had worked years to build. As Rajesh quietly watched, Daniel's frustration grew. The initial thrill of the affair was wearing off for him. While he enjoyed Meera's affection, he wanted more money, more freedom, and a future. The tension in the Malhotra household reached its breaking point when Rajesh finally decided he could no longer ignore the signs. For weeks he had been suspicious, his sharp instincts telling him that his wife's erratic behavior was more than simple restlessness. One evening, when Meera claimed she was going to meet a friend, Rajesh quietly followed her. What he discovered confirmed his worst fears. He watched from a distance as she entered a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, greeted moments later by Daniel Hayes. The sight of his wife, the woman he had built his life with, slipping into the arms of a man young enough to be his son, ignited a fury inside him that he carefully hid behind a cold mask of control. Without confronting her that night, he returned home in silence, but a plan began forming in his mind. Rajesh was a man who had built everything on discipline, and betrayal was something he could neither forgive nor forget. To him, this was not only personal humiliation, but a threat to his reputation, his business, and everything he stood for. Yet rather than explode immediately, he chose patience. He would confront the situation only when he had gathered his thoughts. Meera, unaware of her husband's discovery, continued her secret life with Daniel. She sensed Rajesh's distance, but told herself it was nothing unusual. Convincing herself she still had time to decide between her marriage and her forbidden affair. On the other side, Daniel felt the pressure of time closing in on him. His debts were mounting again, and the flow of money from Meera was no longer enough. He grew restless and began pushing her harder. He wanted her to make a decision, to leave Rajesh, take her share of the wealth, and run away with him. He promised her a fresh start, a new life in another city or even another country, where no one would judge them. Meera hesitated. She was torn between her desire for Daniel and her fear of losing everything else she had built with Rajesh, including the fragile bond with her children. Divorce felt like an impossible scandal, one that would shame her and destroy her carefully constructed world. As her reluctance dragged on, Daniel's frustration boiled into anger. He began to see Rajesh not only as an obstacle, but as the single force preventing him from getting the life he wanted. He started speaking about more drastic solutions. At first, Meera was horrified when he suggested eliminating her husband. She tried to laugh it off, convincing herself he could not be serious. But Daniel kept pressing, painting visions of freedom where they could live without fear. Slowly, her fear turned into dangerous rationalization. She told herself that Rajesh would never forgive her if he learned the truth. She imagined her life in ruins, her name disgraced, her children cutting ties. And then Daniel's words began to make sense to her in ways they never should have. The two of them began discussing what once would have seemed unimaginable. The plan was reckless and simple. Daniel would enter the Malhotra home late one evening when Rajesh was alone. Meera's job was to distract her husband, making sure he was unguarded. The rest, Daniel assured her, would be quick. It was a scheme born out of desperation and lust, crafted without thought for consequences. Meera felt her heart race each time they discussed it, knowing she was crossing a line she could never return from. What she told herself was love was, in truth, pulling her into a nightmare she could not escape. The night they had spoken about finally arrived, cloaked in a heavy silence that seemed to hang over the Malhotra home. Meera went about her evening routine, though her hands trembled as she prepared dinner. Rajesh, seated at the dining table, observed her closely. His sharp eyes noticed every small detail, the nervousness in her movements, the way she avoided his gaze, the faint tremor in her voice. Though she believed she was playing her part well, Rajesh sensed that something unusual was happening. He remained calm, his demeanor giving away nothing, but inside he was ready for whatever might unfold. Hours passed, and the house grew quieter as the city outside settled into the late hours of the night. Meera excused herself to another room under the guise of tidying up, while Daniel approached the house from the back, dressed in dark clothes and carrying the weapon he had hidden earlier. The plan was straightforward in his mind: strike quickly, eliminate Rajesh, and escape into the night. What he had not considered was the strength of the man he intended to overpower. The moment Daniel stepped into the living room, Rajesh turned to face him. For a split second, the air froze, two men staring at each other with a silent understanding of why this confrontation was happening. Daniel lunged forward, weapon in hand, but Rajesh reacted with the instinct of a man who had faced many battles in his life. The struggle was immediate and violent. Furniture toppled as they crashed into the table, glass shattered across the floor, and the quiet house became filled with the sounds of chaos. Meera stood frozen at first, her body rigid with fear, unable to move as the two men fought before her eyes. Daniel, fueled by rage and desperation, pressed his attack relentlessly. Rajesh, though older, fought with the strength of a man unwilling to surrender his life so easily. He struck back with his fists, grabbing at Daniel's arms, trying to wrestle the weapon away. The fight spilled across the room, leaving marks of destruction in every corner. For a moment, it seemed as though Rajesh might overpower the younger man. His grip tightened, his voice roared in fury, and Daniel's confidence faltered. But Daniel had youth and desperation on his side, and in the end that became the deciding factor. With a sudden burst of strength, Daniel broke free and struck with brutal force. The final blow landed and Rajesh collapsed to the floor, his breath escaping in a heavy gasp that faded into silence. Blood spread across the polished tiles, a stark reminder of the irreversible act that had just taken place. Meera's knees buckled, and she fell back against the wall, staring at her husband's lifeless body. The weight of her choices crashed down on her, crushing any illusion of freedom she had once imagined. Daniel, panting heavily, urged her to help him clean up, but their attempts were clumsy and rushed. They wiped surfaces in panic, moved objects around, and tried to stage the scene, but the mess of their crime was too great to hide. Worse still, neighbors had already become suspicious after hearing the sounds of shouting and breaking glass. Security cameras positioned around the neighborhood had captured Daniel entering through the back. Every detail they ignored in their panic was being recorded, building evidence against them with every passing minute. By the time Daniel and Meera thought they had managed to cover their tracks, it was already too late. Their perfect crime had unraveled before it could even begin. The shadows of their actions lingered in the house, and the silence that followed was heavier than any noise. Rajesh was gone, and with him, the life they both thought they could control slipped into disaster. Police arrived at the Malhotra residence in the early hours of the morning, after a concerned neighbor called about strange noises coming from the house. The moment officers entered, the grim reality was exposed. Rajesh Malhotra lay lifeless on the living room floor. Blood pooled around him, and signs of a violent struggle scattered across the room. Broken glass, overturned furniture, and stains on the walls told the story of a desperate fight that had ended in tragedy. Meera sat nearby, pale and shaking, while Daniel attempted to sneak out through the back door. He was caught before he could flee, dragged back inside in handcuffs, his clothes marked with blood he could not explain away. Investigators quickly pieced together the initial details. CCTV footage from nearby cameras showed Daniel entering the property that night. His fingerprints were found on the weapon, on the doorknobs, and across the room. Meera's presence at the scene was equally suspicious. Though she claimed to be a terrified bystander, her nervous demeanor and the discovery of secret phone messages between her and Daniel painted a far darker picture. The affair that had been hidden from public view was now exposed, laid bare under the harsh lights of interrogation rooms. In the days that followed, the case grew into a sensational scandal. News outlets labeled it the Restaurant Queen murder, a shocking story of betrayal and greed that captured the attention of both local and international media. The narrative of a wealthy Indian businessman, a lonely wife, and a much younger lover fit the headlines perfectly. Every detail was dissected: Meera's quiet life as a devoted wife, her sudden descent into an affair, Daniel's troubled background, and the violent end that destroyed a respected family name. The community that once admired the Malhotras now whispered in disgust and fascination, wondering how a storybook life could unravel into bloodshed. During questioning, Daniel tried to shift blame entirely onto Meera. He claimed she had manipulated him, feeding him lies about her unhappy marriage, convincing him that murder was the only way they could be together. He portrayed himself as a victim of her influence, a naive man who had been drawn into something he never truly wanted. Meera, however, told a very different story. She painted Daniel as the aggressor, insisting that she never asked him to harm her husband, that he had forced his way into her life and pushed her into fear-driven decisions. But investigators were not swayed by their conflicting tales. The evidence spoke louder than their words. Dozens of text messages revealed their intimate relationship and their chilling discussions about Rajesh's presence being the obstacle to their freedom. The trial that followed was a spectacle, the courtroom filled with journalists, curious onlookers, and devastated family members. Each testimony revealed the cracks in their defense. The prosecution painted a clear picture. Meera and Daniel had conspired together, fueled by lust and greed, to remove the man standing in their way. The defense scrambled to separate their culpability, but the digital trail and physical evidence left little room for doubt. In the end, justice was delivered. Daniel Hayes was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, his youth wasted in a cell for a crime of passion and greed. Meera Malhotra, though her role was more subtle, received a long prison sentence for conspiracy and aiding the murder of her husband. Her name, once spoken with respect, was forever tarnished. The empire Rajesh had built crumbled under the weight of scandal, his restaurant sold off and his legacy stained. What began as a secret affair ended in blood, betrayal, and irreversible loss. The Malhotra story became a warning, a reminder that secrets have a way of surfacing, and that obsession, when left unchecked, can lead even ordinary people into unimaginable darkness.